The emergency broadcast crackled through the static, its automated voice echoing through the abandoned radio station where Zephyr Blackwood hunched over the transmission equipment. Her calloused fingers adjusted the frequency dial with practiced precision, searching for any sign of life beyond the endless loop of government warnings that had been playing for 3 months. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across banks of silent monitors that once connected this small Montana station to the outside world. Day 97 since the outbreak began in New York, Zephyr whispered into her personal recorder, a habit she'd maintained since the first reports of the infection surfaced. Still no word from the federal government. The automated systems are failing one by one. She paused, listening to the wind howl through the broken windows of the station's upper floor. Somewhere in the distance, the familiar moan of the infected drifted across the snow-covered plains. The infection had spread faster than anyone could have imagined. What started as isolated incidents in major metropolitan areas had become a nationwide catastrophe within weeks. The media had initially called them rage victims, people afflicted with an unknown pathogen that stripped away their humanity and left them with an insatiable hunger for living flesh. But Zephyr knew better than most what they really were. She'd seen her own broadcast team torn apart by creatures that had once been their colleagues, their friends, their family. A sharp bang echoed from the station's main entrance, followed by the scraping sound of fingernails against metal. Zephyr's hand instinctively moved to the shotgun propped against her chair. She'd barricaded the doors weeks ago, but the infected had a way of finding weaknesses in even the most secure defenses. Their persistence was terrifying in its simplicity. They never tired, never gave up, never stopped hunting. Through the security monitor, she watched a small group of infected stumble through the parking lot. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. Their clothes hung in tatters, stained with blood and worse things. What disturbed Zephyr most wasn't their appearance, but their eyes, completely white, as if the infection had burned away everything that made them human. The radio suddenly burst to life with a new signal, cutting through the static with crystal clarity. This is Meridian Ashworth broadcasting from the Denver safe zone. If anyone can hear this transmission, we are organizing a final evacuation to the Northern Territories. Repeat, this is not a drill. The infection has breached our perimeter, and we estimate less than 48 hours before total containment failure. Zephyr's heart raced as she grabbed the microphone. Denver safe zone, this is radio station KMTN in Glacier Falls, Montana. I copy your transmission. What's your status? How many survivors? She released the button and waited, counting the seconds that stretched into eternity. Came in, thank God, came the reply. We have approximately 200 civilians and 50 military personnel. The infection rate is accelerating beyond our projections. We need immediate assistance with evacuation routes to the Canadian border. Can you provide intel on northern passages? Before Zephyr could respond, another voice cut through the frequency, younger, more desperate. This is Cashin Thorne in Minneapolis. The city is gone. Completely overrun. I'm trapped in the federal building with maybe a dozen other survivors. If anyone's listening, don't come here. Don't try to save us. The infected, they're changing. Evolving. They're learning to use tools to coordinate attacks. This isn't just an infection anymore, it's something else entirely. The transmission dissolved into screams and the sound of breaking glass. Zephyr stared at the radio in horror, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. Evolving infected? The reports she'd been monitoring had mentioned increased aggression and pack behavior, but nothing about tool use or coordination. If Cashin was right, humanity's chances of survival had just dropped to nearly zero. A new sound drew her attention back to the security monitors. A convoy of military vehicles was approaching the station, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Zephyr counted 3 Humvees and what looked like an armored personnel carrier. As they drew closer, she could see soldiers in full combat gear scanning the perimeter with automatic weapons. The lead vehicle stopped directly in front of the station, and a figure emerged from the passenger seat. Even through the grainy monitor, Zephyr could see the insignia of a high-ranking officer. The soldier approached the main entrance and spoke into a radio, his voice carrying clearly through the building's damaged walls. Survivor confirmed at radio station KMTN. Requesting permission to extract and proceed to Rally Point Omega. He paused, listening to his earpiece. Copy that, command. We'll bring her in. Zephyr faced an impossible choice. Stay in her fortified position and maintain the radio link that might be humanity's last hope for coordination, Or trust these soldiers and potentially walk into a trap? Outside, the infected were gathering in larger numbers, drawn by the noise of the vehicles. Time was running out, and whatever decision she made would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the fate of every remaining survivor in North America. The soldier's voice boomed through a megaphone, cutting through the moans of the approaching infected. Civilian inside the radio station, this is Colonel Thaddeus Grimm, United States Army. We're here to extract you to a secure location. You have 60 seconds to gather essential supplies and exit through the rear emergency door. Zephyr's hands moved with practiced efficiency, stuffing her portable radio equipment, ammunition, and emergency rations into a military surplus backpack. She'd prepared for this moment countless times, but the reality of abandoning her sanctuary felt like tearing away a piece of her soul. The radio station had been her lifeline to the outside world, her purpose in a world that had lost all meaning. Through the rear window, she could see two soldiers positioning themselves to provide cover. Their movements were precise and professional, but she noticed the way their eyes constantly darted toward the shadows, the slight tremor in their hands as they gripped their weapons. Even the military was afraid now. The infected had begun to surround the building, their numbers swelling as more emerged from the surrounding forest. Zephyr counted at least 30, with more arriving every minute. They moved with disturbing purpose, no longer the shambling masses depicted in old horror movies. These creatures had learned to hunt in coordinated groups, using basic tactics that suggested a terrifying level of retained intelligence. 30 seconds. Colonel Grimm's voice carried an edge of urgency. Through the front monitors, Zephyr could see infected climbing onto the military vehicles, their clawed fingers scraping against armored glass. The soldiers were firing controlled bursts, but for every infected they dropped, two more seemed to take its place. Zephyr slung the backpack over her shoulders and grabbed her shotgun. She took one last look at the radio equipment that had been her companion for 3 months, then activated the emergency broadcast system. Her pre-recorded message would continue transmitting for another week, warning other survivors about the evolving nature of the infection and providing coordinates for potential safe zones. The rear emergency door opened with a rusty screech that seemed to echo across the entire valley. Immediately, the two soldiers flanked her, their weapons trained on the treeline. "Move fast, stay low, and don't look back," one of them whispered. His name tape read, Valencia, and despite the tactical gear covering most of his face, Zephyr could see he was barely out of his teens. They sprinted across the open ground toward the waiting vehicles, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Behind them, the infected had detected their movement and were pouring around the building like a dark tide. Their inhuman shrieks filled the air, a sound that bypassed rational thought and triggered every primal fear hardwired into human DNA. "Contact rear," Valencia shouted, spinning to fire at an infected that had broken away from the main group. The creature moved with unnatural speed, its limbs contorting in ways that defied human anatomy. Valencia's shots found their mark, but the infected continued advancing until the final round destroyed its brain stem. Colonel Grimm was already in the lead Humvee, barking orders into his radio. "All units, we have the package. Execute immediate withdrawal to Rally Point Omega. Use incendiary rounds if necessary." He turned to help Zephyr into the vehicle, his weathered face grim with determination. "Ma'am, I need you to know that what you've been doing here, maintaining communications, gathering intelligence, it's been invaluable to our operations." As their convoy pulled away from the radio station, Zephyr watched through the rear window as the infected swarmed over the building. Some of them were using rocks and debris to break windows, while others seemed to be examining the abandoned equipment with disturbing curiosity. The sight confirmed her worst fears about their evolving intelligence. "Colonel, I intercepted a transmission from Minneapolis," Zephyr said, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "A survivor named Cashin Thorne reported that the infected are using tools and coordinating attacks. Is that consistent with what you've observed?" Grimm's expression darkened. "Unfortunately, yes. Our field reports indicate significant behavioral changes over the past month. They're retaining more cognitive function than initially projected. Some can even operate simple machinery." He paused, studying a tactical map spread across his lap. "That's why we're consolidating all remaining survivors at Rally Point Omega. It's our last chance to establish a defensible position before winter sets in." The convoy navigated through abandoned towns and cities, each one a monument to humanity's rapid fall. Cars sat empty on highways, their doors hanging open as if their occupants had simply vanished. Buildings stood like hollow shells, their windows dark and lifeless. Occasionally they passed groups of infected wandering aimlessly through the streets, but the creatures seemed less aggressive during daylight hours. How many survivors are we talking about? Zephyr asked, though she dreaded the answer. Nationwide? Maybe 10,000, scattered across dozens of isolated groups. Rally Point Omega currently houses about 800, but we're expecting that number to drop significantly over the next few weeks. Grimm's honesty was brutal but necessary. The infection rate is accelerating, and our ammunition supplies are running critically low. As they crested a hill overlooking a vast valley, Zephyr saw their destination in the distance. Rally Point Omega was a massive military installation built into the side of a mountain, its concrete walls and defensive positions carved directly from the rock face. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, and she could see tiny figures moving along the perimeter walls. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. But that hope was tempered by the sight of massive funeral pyres burning outside the installation's walls, their black smoke rising like pillars into the gray sky. Even in humanity's last stronghold, death was a constant companion. The massive steel gates of Rally Point Omega groaned open as their convoy approached, revealing a bustling underground city carved into the mountain's heart. Zephyr marveled at the engineering feat before her, multiple levels connected by reinforced tunnels, with living quarters, workshops, and command centers all protected by hundreds of feet of solid rock. Emergency lighting cast everything in an amber glow, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that felt both secure and claustrophobic. Colonel Grimm led her through a maze of corridors filled with survivors from across the country. She saw families huddled together in makeshift living spaces, children playing with improvised toys while their parents maintained weapons and equipment. The air hummed with quiet conversations in dozens of languages, creating a babble of human voices that somehow felt comforting after months of isolation. The facility was originally designed as a continuity of government bunker, Grimm explained as they walked. Built during the Cold War to house essential personnel in case of nuclear attack. Ironic that it's now protecting us from something far worse than atomic weapons. He stopped at a reinforced door marked Communications Center, and gestured for Zephyr to enter. Inside, she found a sophisticated radio operation that dwarfed her modest station setup. Banks of equipment lined the walls, manned by operators wearing headsets and monitoring multiple frequencies simultaneously. At the center of it all sat a woman with silver-streaked hair and intense green eyes, coordinating communications with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. Zephyr Blackwood, meet Dr. Serafina Cross, Grimm said. She's been running our intelligence operations since the outbreak began. Dr. Cross, this is the radio operator who's been maintaining the Montana relay station. Dr. Cross stood and extended her hand, her grip firm and confident. Your transmissions have been invaluable, Miss Blackwood. You've helped us coordinate the evacuation of over 300 survivors from the Northern Territories. Her expression grew somber. I'm afraid I have disturbing news about the transmission you intercepted from Minneapolis. She led them to a large display screen showing a map of North America dotted with red and green indicators. The red zones vastly outnumbered the green, creating a visual representation of humanity's desperate situation. We lost contact with Cash and Thorn's group 6 hours ago. Satellite imagery shows the federal building completely overrun, with infected displaying unprecedented organizational behavior. The screen switched to grainy aerial footage that made Zephyr's blood run cold. Hundreds of infected had formed organized lines around the building, while others appeared to be constructing crude barriers from debris and abandoned vehicles. Some were even using tools to break through reinforced doors and windows with methodical precision. They're learning, Dr. Cross continued. Our xenobiologists believe the pathogen is somehow preserving and enhancing certain cognitive functions while eliminating others. They retain problem-solving abilities and basic tool use, but lose all empathy, fear, and self-preservation instincts. It makes them perfect predators. A young man with distinctive facial tattoos approached their group, his military uniform bearing the insignia of a communications specialist. Dr. Cross, we're receiving multiple distress signals from the Denver safe zone. It sounds like their perimeter has been completely breached. Dr. Cross activated her headset and tuned into the frequency. The voice that emerged was Meridian Ashworth, the same person Zephyr had heard during her final transmission from the radio station. But now his calm professionalism had been replaced by barely controlled panic. Rally Point Omega, this is Denver safe zone. We are experiencing total containment failure. The infected have breached all 3 defensive perimeters and are advancing on the civilian shelters. We have approximately 50 survivors attempting to reach the emergency evacuation point, but they're being systematically hunted by coordinated infected groups. Dr. Cross grabbed the microphone. Denver Safe Zone, this is Rally Point Omega. What's your current position and available resources for extraction? We're trapped in the underground parking garage of the Federal Center. The infected have blocked all surface exits and appear to be using some kind of communication system, clicking sounds, almost like a language. They're not just hunting us, they're herding us into specific areas. The transmission was interrupted by gunfire and screaming. When Meridian's voice returned, it was barely a whisper. They're in the garage. They've learned to operate the elevator systems. Oh God, they're using the elevators to coordinate their attack. This is our final transmission. Tell the world what happened here. Tell them the infected are no longer just mindless monsters. The radio fell silent except for the sound of distant explosions. Dr. Cross stared at the equipment for a long moment before turning to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just witnessed the fall of our largest remaining safe zone. As of this moment, Rally Point Omega houses the largest concentration of survivors in North America. The weight of that statement settled over everyone like a shroud. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were potentially the last hope for human civilization on the continent. The responsibility was crushing, but it also brought a sense of purpose that had been missing since the outbreak began. Colonel Grimm stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of a lifetime military officer. We need to assume that the infected will eventually locate this facility. Our defensive advantages are significant, but they won't hold indefinitely against an enemy that can learn and adapt. We need to start planning for the possibility of a final evacuation. Evacuation to where? Asked the communications specialist with the facial tattoos. Every major population center is gone. The Canadian border is overrun. Even if we could reach the coast, where would we go? Dr. Cross pulled up another map, this one showing ocean currents and weather patterns. There are several remote island chains that might offer temporary sanctuary. The Aleutians, some of the more isolated Caribbean islands, possibly even Antarctica research stations. The infected seem to have difficulty crossing large bodies of water. Zephyr studied the map, her mind racing through the logistics of such an operation. What about communication with other continents? Have we received any transmissions from Europe, Asia, or Australia? Sporadic signals suggest that the infection has spread globally, but some regions appear to be maintaining organized resistance, Dr. Cross replied. The problem is that our long-range communication capabilities are limited, and we can't verify the authenticity of most transmissions. As if summoned by their conversation, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Red warning lights bathed the corridors in an ominous glow as an automated voice announced, "Perimeter breach detected. All personnel to defensive positions." This is not a drill. Through the communication center's monitors, they could see the first wave of infected emerging from the forest surrounding Rally Point Omega. But these weren't the shambling hordes they'd grown accustomed to fighting. These infected moved with purpose and coordination. Spreading out to surround the facility, the infected approached Rally Point Omega with a tactical precision that defied everything the survivors thought they knew about the creatures. Through the perimeter cameras, Zephyr watched in horror as hundreds of them emerged from the treeline in organized formations, some carrying crude weapons fashioned from scavenged materials. They moved like a military unit conducting a siege operation, establishing positions that would cut off all escape routes from the mountain facility. "Jesus Christ," whispered the communications specialist, whose name tag read Kane. "They're setting up a perimeter. Look at that, they're actually posting sentries at strategic points." Dr. Cross activated the facility's external speakers, her voice echoing across the valley. "This is Dr. Serafina Cross of Rally Point Omega. We know you can understand us. We're willing to negotiate. There's no need for further bloodshed." The response came not in words, but in a series of clicking sounds that seemed to ripple through the infected ranks like a wave. The creatures closest to the facility began making rhythmic tapping noises against rocks and metal debris, creating an eerie percussion that reverberated off the mountain walls. It was unmistakably a form of communication, complex and purposeful. Colonel Grimm was already coordinating defensive positions through his radio. All units to level Alpha defensive stations. Snipers to elevated positions. Do not engage unless they breach the outer perimeter. Conserve ammunition and wait for my command. He turned to Dr. Cross with grim determination. "Doctor, how long can we hold out with current supplies?" "Food and water for maybe 6 weeks if we implement strict rationing. Ammunition is the real concern. We have enough for perhaps 3 major engagements, assuming standard infected behavior patterns." She gestured toward the monitors showing the organized enemy forces. But this isn't standard behavior. They're adapting faster than our models predicted. Zephyr found herself drawn to one particular monitor that showed a group of infected working together to construct what appeared to be siege equipment from abandoned vehicles and construction materials. They were building crude catapults and battering rams with an efficiency that suggested retained engineering knowledge. "They're not just using tools," she observed, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're manufacturing weapons. Some of them must have been engineers, construction workers, military personnel before the infection. They're retaining professional skills." The implications were staggering. If the infected could retain and apply specialized knowledge, they weren't just dealing with mindless predators anymore. They were facing an enemy that combined human intelligence with inhuman persistence and coordination. An enemy that felt no fear, required no rest, and had unlimited time to perfect their strategies. A new voice crackled through the radio system, young, frightened but determined. "Rally Point Omega. This is Lysander Voss broadcasting from a mobile unit approximately 50 miles northeast of your position. I'm traveling with a group of 12 survivors including 2 children. We've been monitoring your transmissions and request permission to approach." Dr. Cross exchanged glances with Colonel Grimm before responding. "Lysander Voss, this is Rally Point Omega. We are currently under siege by organized infected forces. Approach is not recommended at this time. What's your current status and defensive capabilities?" "We're in 2 armored vehicles with limited ammunition. We've been running for 3 days since our settlement was overrun. The infected that attacked us were using coordinated tactics. They cut our power, blocked our escape routes, and systematically eliminated our defensive positions. We barely escaped with our lives." The pattern was becoming clear. The infected weren't just randomly attacking human settlements anymore. They were conducting strategic operations designed to maximize casualties and minimize their own losses. They were learning from each encounter, adapting their tactics, and sharing information across their network. "Lysander, maintain your current position and establish a defensive perimeter," Colonel Grimm instructed. "We'll attempt to coordinate an extraction once we've dealt with our current situation. Do not attempt to approach Rally Point Omega until further notice." The clicking sounds from outside were growing louder and more complex, creating an almost musical pattern that seemed to be building toward some kind of crescendo. Through the monitors, they could see the infected had completed their siege preparations and were now arranged in perfect formation around the facility's perimeter. Suddenly the clicking stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound the creatures had made. For several long minutes, nothing moved except the wind through the trees. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, the infected began their assault. The first wave came from 3 directions simultaneously, with groups of infected using their crude siege weapons to target the facility's external defenses. Catapults hurled flaming debris at the entrance gates while others used battering rams to test the strength of reinforced barriers. The coordination was flawless, suggesting a level of tactical planning that rivaled human military operations. "All defensive positions you are cleared to engage," Colonel Grimm commanded. "Prioritize targets operating siege equipment. Snipers, take out any infected that appear to be directing the assault." The mountain facility erupted in gunfire as defenders opened up from concealed positions. The infected fell in waves, but for every one that dropped, 2 more seemed to take its place. Worse, the creatures were learning from the defensive fire patterns, adjusting their approach routes to minimize casualties. Dr. Cross was monitoring multiple communication channels, trying to coordinate with other survivor groups while managing the crisis at hand. "We're receiving reports of similar coordinated attacks at survivor settlements across the region. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a continent-wide offensive." Zephyr watched the battle unfold with growing dread. The infected were displaying tactical flexibility that suggested they were capable of real-time strategic thinking. When their initial assault was repelled, they immediately shifted to different approach vectors, probing for weaknesses in the facility's defenses. "They're testing us," she realized aloud. "This isn't their main attack, they're gathering intelligence about our defensive capabilities. They're learning how we fight so they can develop countermeasures." As if to confirm her assessment, the infected suddenly withdrew from their assault positions, melting back into the forest with the same coordinated precision they'd shown during their approach. Within minutes, the perimeter was clear except for the bodies of those who had fallen during the attack. But the silence that followed felt more ominous than the battle itself. The infected hadn't retreated in defeat, they had gathered the information they needed and were now preparing for the real assault. And when it came, they would be ready for everything the survivors could throw at them. In the aftermath of the probing attack, Rally Point Omega buzzed with frantic activity as survivors worked to reinforce defenses and treat the wounded. The medical bay, carved deep into the mountain's core, overflowed with casualties from the brief but intense engagement. Dr. Cross moved between the wounded and the communication center, coordinating medical supplies while monitoring radio frequencies for any sign of the infected's next move. Zephyr found herself assigned to a new role, analyzing the infected's communication patterns. Using sophisticated audio equipment salvaged from various military installations, she worked alongside a brilliant cryptographer named Octavia Nightingale, whose expertise in code breaking had proven invaluable since the outbreak began. Together, they studied recordings of the clicking sounds the infected had made during their assault. "It's definitely a language," Octavia confirmed, her fingers dancing across a keyboard as she ran the audio through pattern recognition software. Complex syntax, grammatical structures, even what appears to be regional dialects. They're not just communicating basic information, they're sharing detailed tactical data. The implications were staggering. If the infected had developed their own language, they could coordinate operations across vast distances, share intelligence about human defensive strategies, and potentially plan complex multi-stage attacks. They weren't just predators anymore. They had become a rival species with their own culture and communication systems. Colonel Grimm studied the analysis with growing concern. How far can they transmit these signals? Are we talking about local coordination or something larger? Based on the signal strength and propagation patterns, potentially hundreds of miles, Octavia replied. They seem to be using a combination of audible clicks and subsonic frequencies that can travel through ground vibrations. It's actually more efficient than our radio communications in many ways. A commotion near the facility's main entrance drew their attention to the arrival of Lysander Voss and his group of survivors. The young man appeared to be in his early 20s, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much horror for his age. He carried a small girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, while the rest of his group, a mix of civilians and former military personnel, looked exhausted but determined. "Thank God you made it," Dr. Cross said as she helped them through the security checkpoint. "We weren't sure you'd be able to navigate around the infected perimeter." Lysander set the little girl down gently, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "We didn't go around them. We went through them. They let us pass." He paused, seeing the shocked expressions on everyone's faces. "I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you the truth. They watched us approach, made those clicking sounds, and then simply moved aside to create a corridor." The silence that followed was deafening. If the infected were selectively allowing certain humans to pass, it suggested a level of strategic thinking that went beyond anything they'd previously encountered. Were they trying to increase the population at Rally Point Omega for some reason? Were they planning to use the facility as some kind of breeding ground or food storage? Did they make any attempt to communicate with you directly? Dr. Cross asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. "Not in any way we could understand," replied one of Lysander's companions, a weathered woman with military bearing whose name tag read Torres. "But there was definitely intelligence behind their actions. They weren't just letting us pass randomly, they were making a deliberate choice." Octavia pulled up a new analysis on her computer screen, showing communication patterns recorded during Lysander's approach to the facility. The clicking patterns changed significantly when your group appeared. They were definitely discussing you, possibly debating whether to allow passage. The little girl that Lysander had been carrying tugged on Dr. Cross's lab coat, her voice barely above a whisper. "The sick people aren't really sick. They're just different now. They told me so in my dreams." Everyone in the room froze. Children had always been considered immune to the infection, but no one had reported any kind of communication between infected and uninfected individuals, especially not through dreams. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Dr. Cross asked, kneeling down to the child's level. "Evangeline," the girl replied. "The different people say they're not trying to hurt us. They're trying to save us from something worse that's coming." Before anyone could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the facility once again. But this time the warning wasn't about a perimeter breach, it was about incoming aircraft. Through the external monitors, they could see military helicopters approaching from the south, their rotors cutting through the mountain air with urgent purpose. Colonel Grimm was already on his radio, attempting to establish contact with the incoming aircraft. "Unidentified helicopters approaching Rally Point Omega, this is Colonel Thaddeus Grimm. Identify yourselves and state your intentions." The response came through clearly, carrying the authority of high command. "Colonel Grimm, this is General Maximus Steele, United States Northern Command. We are conducting emergency evacuation of all personnel from Rally Point Omega. You have 30 minutes to prepare for immediate departure. General, with respect, we have over 800 civilians in this facility. 30 minutes isn't sufficient time for a complete evacuation. What's the nature of the emergency? Colonel, we have confirmed reports of a massive infected convergence moving toward your position. Satellite imagery shows over 50,000 infected approaching from multiple directions. They'll reach your perimeter within 6 hours. This facility cannot withstand an assault of that magnitude. The number hit everyone like a physical blow. 50,000 infected, all moving with coordinated purpose toward their location. It wasn't just an attack, it was an extinction event. Every infected creature within hundreds of miles was converging on Rally Point Omega, drawn by some signal or purpose that defied human understanding. Dr. Cross was already calculating evacuation logistics in her head. General, we can evacuate maybe 200 people in 30 minutes. What about the rest? The pause before General Steele's response told them everything they needed to know. Doctor, we'll do everything we can, but our primary mission is to preserve essential personnel and critical intelligence. The infected appear to be specifically targeting major survivor concentrations. Rally Point Omega is just the first. As if summoned by the General's words, the infected around the facility's perimeter began their clicking communication again. But this time the sound was different, more urgent, more excited. Through the monitors, they could see the creatures looking toward the southern horizon, where the first signs of the massive convergence were beginning to appear. The final battle for Rally Point Omega was about to begin, and humanity's last stronghold was running out of time. The southern horizon darkened like an approaching storm, but instead of clouds, it was a living tide of infected humanity stretching as far as the eye could see. Through high-powered telescopes mounted on Rally Point Omega's observation posts, the survivors watched in horrified fascination as the massive convergence approached with mechanical precision. The infected moved in organized columns, their formation suggesting military-level coordination that defied every assumption about their capabilities. General Steele's helicopters had landed in the facility's emergency landing zone, their rotors still spinning as evacuation teams worked frantically to load essential personnel and equipment. The general himself was an imposing figure with steel-gray hair and eyes that had witnessed the fall of civilization, yet maintained an unwavering determination to preserve what remained of humanity. Dr. Cross, your research data on infected communication patterns is critical to our long-term survival strategy, he said, personally overseeing the loading of her equipment. We've established a new command center on a naval vessel in the Arctic Ocean. It's our best hope for maintaining organized resistance. Zephyr found herself torn between evacuation and duty. Her radio equipment could provide crucial communication links during the evacuation, but someone needed to stay behind to coordinate with other survivor groups until the very last moment. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her like a physical force. I'm staying, she announced, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. Someone needs to maintain communications until everyone who can be evacuated is safely away. I can buy you time. Colonel Grimm shook his head firmly. Absolutely not. You're too valuable to lose. We need experienced radio operators for the new command structure. And I need to know that we did everything possible to save as many people as we could, Zephyr replied. Give me a portable radio and extraction coordinates. I'll maintain contact until the facility is overrun, then attempt to reach the secondary evacuation point. Before anyone could argue further, young Evangeline appeared at Zephyr's side, her small hand slipping into the radio operator's calloused palm. I'm staying too. The different people want to talk to someone who can understand them. The adults exchanged alarmed glances. The idea of leaving a 6-year-old child in a facility about to be overrun by infected was unthinkable, but Evangeline's claims about communication with the creatures had proven disturbingly accurate. If she really could serve as some kind of translator or intermediary, her presence might be the key to understanding the infected's ultimate goals. Dr. Cross knelt beside the little girl, her voice gentle but urgent. Evangeline, what do the different people want? Why are so many of them coming here? They're scared, the child replied matter-of-factly. Something bad is coming from the sky and they think the mountain will protect them. They want to share the safe place with us. The revelation hit everyone like a thunderbolt. The infected weren't planning to attack Rally Point Omega. They were seeking shelter there. But shelter from what? And why did they believe the mountain facility could protect them from an aerial threat? General Steele was already on his radio, contacting his intelligence officers. Command, I need immediate satellite surveillance of all airspace within 500 miles of Rally Point Omega. Look for any anomalous aircraft, atmospheric disturbances, or unidentified flying objects. The response came back within minutes, and the general's face went pale as he listened to the report. Colonel, we have a problem. Satellite imagery shows multiple unidentified aircraft approaching from high altitude. They're not showing up on radar, and their flight patterns don't match any known human technology. Through the facility's external speakers, they could hear the infected's clicking communication growing more frantic and urgent. The massive convergence had reached the facility's outer perimeter, but instead of attacking, the creatures were spreading out to form defensive positions facing skyward. They were preparing to fight something coming from above. Octavia's communication analysis equipment was picking up new patterns in the infected signals, complex mathematical sequences that seemed to be calculating trajectory and timing data. They're tracking something, she announced. Multiple objects in high-altitude approach vectors. Whatever's coming, they know exactly when and where it will arrive. Lysander, who had been helping with the evacuation, suddenly stopped and pointed toward the sky. There. Do you see that? High above the mountain, barely visible against the gray clouds, dark shapes were descending toward the facility. They moved with unnatural smoothness, defying conventional aerodynamics as they shifted and changed direction without any visible means of propulsion. As they drew closer, their alien geometry became apparent. These were not human aircraft. The infected around the facility erupted in a cacophony of clicking sounds that seemed to coordinate their defensive preparations. Some of the creatures began constructing crude anti-aircraft weapons from scavenged materials, while others took positions that would allow them to engage aerial targets. They were preparing to defend Rally Point Omega. The infected around the facility erupted in a cacophony of clicking sounds that seemed to coordinate their defensive preparations. Some of the creatures began constructing crude anti-aircraft weapons from scavenged materials, while others took positions that would allow them to engage aerial targets. They were preparing to defend Rally Point Omega against the descending alien craft. My God, Dr. Cross whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. The infection wasn't a disease at all. It was preparation. They were being modified to fight something else. General Steele was barking orders into his radio, trying to coordinate a response to a threat that defied all military doctrine. All units, we have confirmed extraterrestrial contact. Repeat, we are dealing with non-human entities. Abort evacuation and prepare for defensive operations. The alien craft descended with predatory grace, their dark surfaces seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. As they drew closer, the survivors could see that they weren't mechanical constructs but something organic, living ships that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns along their hulls. The largest of them was easily the size of a football stadium, its presence casting the entire valley into shadow. Evangeline squeezed Zephyr's hand tighter, her young voice carrying an eerie calm. The different people say the sky hunters have been following them across the stars. They came to Earth to hide, but the hunters found them anyway. Now everyone has to fight together or everyone dies. The first alien craft opened with a sound like tearing metal, revealing rows of creatures that bore no resemblance to anything in Earth's evolutionary history. They were tall and angular, with multiple limbs that ended in razor-sharp appendages, and their movements suggested a hive-mind intelligence that coordinated their actions with perfect precision. The infected responded immediately, launching their crude projectiles at the descending aliens while emitting a war cry that combined human vocal cords with something far more primal. The battle that erupted was unlike anything in recorded history, two alien species fighting for dominance while humanity watched from the sidelines. We need to get underground, Colonel Grimm shouted over the chaos. The facility's lower levels were designed to withstand nuclear attack. They should provide protection from whatever weapons these things are using. But as they moved toward the facility's interior, Zephyr realized that evacuation was no longer an option. The alien craft had surrounded the mountain, cutting off all escape routes. General Steele's helicopters were grounded, their pilots unwilling to risk flight in the middle of an aerial battle between hostile alien forces. The infected were fighting with desperate ferocity, using their retained human knowledge to construct increasingly sophisticated weapons from the facility's abandoned equipment. Some had fashioned electromagnetic pulse devices that seemed to disrupt the aliens' coordination, while others had created incendiary weapons that could damage the organic hulls of the alien craft. They're buying us time, Dr. Cross observed, watching the battle through reinforced windows. The infected are sacrificing themselves to give us a chance to survive. Octavia's equipment was picking up new communication patterns, not just from the infected but from the alien craft as well. The signals were incredibly complex, suggesting a level of intelligence that dwarfed human cognitive capabilities. "They're both trying to communicate with us," she announced. "The aliens and the infected are sending signals directly to the facility." Zephyr grabbed her portable radio equipment and began scanning frequencies, searching for any coherent message in the chaos of alien communication. What she found chilled her to the bone. The aliens weren't just hunting the infected. They were cataloging human settlements, mapping population centers, and planning a systematic extermination of all life on Earth. The infected were trying to warn us, she realized. They weren't the invasion, they were refugees. And now the real invasion has begun. The battle outside was reaching a crescendo as more alien craft descended from the upper atmosphere. The infected were being overwhelmed despite their desperate resistance, their crude weapons no match for the aliens' advanced technology. But their sacrifice was not in vain. They had revealed the true enemy and given humanity crucial intelligence about the threat they faced. As the facility shook under the impact of alien weapons, the survivors huddled in the deepest levels of Rally Point Omega, listening to the sounds of a war that would determine the fate of two worlds. Above them, the infected continued their hopeless fight, buying precious time for the species they had once been part of. The irony was not lost on any of them. Humanity's salvation might depend on the very creatures they had spent months trying to destroy. Deep in the bowels of Rally Point Omega, the survivors huddled around Octavia's communication equipment as she worked frantically to decode the alien transmissions. The facility's reinforced walls muffled the sounds of battle above, but periodic tremors reminded everyone that the war between the infected and the alien invaders continued to rage across the mountain's surface. "I'm getting something," Octavia announced, her voice tight with concentration. "The alien signals are incredibly complex, but there's a mathematical foundation that's almost familiar. Like they're using principles we understand but applying them in ways we never imagined." Evangeline sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, her eyes closed in concentration as she seemed to listen to voices only she could hear. "The different people are losing," she said quietly. "Too many sky hunters, not enough defenders. They want to know if the underground people will help them fight." General Steele looked up from his tactical maps, his weathered face grim with the weight of an impossible decision. "Help them? These are the same creatures that have been hunting and killing humans for months. How do we know this isn't some kind of trap?" "Because they're dying to protect us," Zephyr replied, monitoring radio frequencies for any sign of other survivor groups. "Look at the tactical situation, General. The infected could have overrun this facility weeks ago if they wanted to. Instead, they've been positioning themselves as a defensive barrier between us and something they knew was coming." Dr. Cross was studying biological samples she'd collected from infected tissue over the past months, comparing them with readings from the alien craft above. "The infection wasn't random," she concluded. "It's a targeted modification designed to enhance human combat capabilities against a specific enemy. Increased strength, coordination, reduced fear response. These are military adaptations." The implications were staggering. If the infected were modified humans designed to fight the alien invaders, then the outbreak hadn't been a catastrophe, it had been preparation for a war that humanity didn't even know was coming. The question now was whether the remaining unmodified humans could find a way to join the fight. A new voice crackled through the radio system, speaking in heavily accented English that suggested a non-native speaker. "Rally Point Omega, this is Commander Aurelia Blackthorne broadcasting from the USS Leviathan. We are a joint international task force operating in Arctic waters. Please respond if you can hear this transmission." Zephyr grabbed the microphone immediately. "Commander Blackthorne, this is Rally Point Omega. We have approximately 800 survivors under siege by extraterrestrial forces. The infected appear to be fighting the aliens, but they're being overwhelmed. What's your status?" "Rally Point Omega, we have been monitoring the situation via satellite. Similar battles are occurring at survivor settlements worldwide. The infected are mounting coordinated resistance against the alien forces, but they lack the technological resources to mount an effective defense. We're preparing to provide air support, but we need ground-based coordination." General Steele took the microphone from Zephyr. "Commander, this is General Maximus Steele. What kind of air support are we talking about? Our intelligence suggests these alien craft are highly advanced. General, we've been developing countermeasures based on infected communication patterns. It appears the creatures have been sharing tactical intelligence about alien weaknesses through their network. We've weaponized some of their discoveries. The conversation was interrupted by a massive explosion that shook the entire facility. Through the communication center's monitors, they could see that one of the larger alien craft had been brought down by a coordinated infected assault. The creatures had somehow managed to disable the ship's propulsion systems, sending it crashing into the valley below. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Hundreds of infected had been killed in the assault, and the remaining alien craft were adapting their tactics to counter the creature's strategies. The battle was turning into a war of attrition that the infected could not win. "We have to help them," Lysander said, his young face set with determination. "Whatever they were before the infection, they're fighting for all of us now. We can't just hide down here while they die protecting us." Colonel Grimm was already organizing the facility's remaining military personnel. "What kind of weapons do we have that could be effective against alien technology?" Dr. Cross consulted her research data. The infected seemed to be using electromagnetic pulse weapons with some success. "We have the components to build larger versions in the facility's workshops. If we can coordinate with their assault patterns." Evangeline suddenly opened her eyes, her voice carrying an urgency that made everyone stop talking. "The different people say the big sky hunter is coming. The one that leads all the others. If it gets here, everyone dies. The different people, the underground people, everyone on the whole world." Through the facility's external sensors, they could detect massive energy signatures approaching from high altitude. Whatever was coming dwarfed the alien craft already engaged in battle above the mountain. The final phase of the invasion was about to begin. "Commander Blackthorne," General Steele spoke into the radio, "we're going to coordinate a joint assault with the infected forces. Transmit your tactical data and prepare for synchronized attack. This might be our only chance to stop whatever's coming." As the survivors prepared to emerge from their underground sanctuary and join the battle raging above, they knew they were about to participate in the most important fight in human history. The alliance between the living and the infected would determine whether Earth remained a world worth saving. The massive alien mothership descended through the clouds like a dark moon, its presence warping the very air around Rally Point Omega. The craft was so large that it blocked out the sun, casting the entire valley into an unnatural twilight that seemed to drain color from the world itself. Along its hull, bioluminescent patterns pulsed with malevolent intelligence, and the survivors could feel its alien consciousness pressing against their minds like a physical weight. Zephyr emerged from the facility's main entrance alongside the other survivors, carrying the portable radio equipment that would coordinate their desperate alliance with the infected. Around the mountain's perimeter, thousands of the modified humans had formed defensive lines, their clicking communication creating a symphony of tactical coordination that rivaled any military operation in human history. "All units, this is Commander Blackthorne," the voice crackled through the radio. "We have visual on the primary target. Initiating attack run in 60 seconds. Ground forces, prepare for synchronized assault on my mark." Dr. Cross had worked through the night to modify the facility's electromagnetic pulse generators, creating weapons that could theoretically disrupt the aliens' organic technology. The infected had somehow communicated the technical specifications through Evangeline, providing crucial intelligence about the invaders' vulnerabilities. General Steele stood beside a hastily constructed command post, coordinating between human military forces, the infected defenders, and the international task force approaching from the north. "This is it, people. Everything we've learned, everything we've sacrificed, comes down to the next few minutes." The infected around the perimeter suddenly fell silent, their clicking communication replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to stretch across the entire valley. Then, as one, they began to emit a low harmonic sound that resonated through the mountain itself. The sound grew in intensity until it became almost unbearable, causing the alien craft to shudder and lose altitude. "They're using sonic weapons," Octavia observed, her equipment registering frequencies that pushed the limits of human hearing. The infection must have modified their vocal cords to produce specific resonances that disrupt alien technology. Evangeline stood at the center of the human group, her small form somehow commanding attention from both species. "The different people say this is the last chance. If the big sky hunter isn't stopped here, it will call more hunters from the dark between stars. Earth will become a dead world like all the others." The mothership responded to the sonic assault by opening massive ports along its hull, releasing swarms of smaller craft that descended like metallic locusts. But the infected were ready. Groups of modified humans launched themselves into the air using improvised catapults and grappling systems, engaging the alien fighters in aerial combat that defied human understanding of physics. Commander Blackthorne's aircraft appeared on the horizon, a formation of experimental fighters equipped with weapons based on infected intelligence. All ground units, mark your targets. We're going in. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. Human technology, infected biological modifications, and alien science clashed in a three-way conflict that would determine the fate of Earth. Zephyr coordinated communications between all three forces, her voice becoming the link that held their desperate alliance together. The electromagnetic pulse weapons proved devastatingly effective against the alien craft, but the mothership's defenses adapted quickly to each attack. For every alien fighter destroyed, two more emerged from the massive vessel's seemingly endless interior. The infected were taking horrific casualties, their modified bodies pushed beyond their limits as they fought with suicidal determination. The mothership's core is exposed. Dr. Cross shouted over the chaos, pointing to a section of the alien vessel where the hull had been damaged by the sonic assault. If we can get a concentrated EMP burst into that opening. But the distance was too great for their ground-based weapons, and the alien defenses were too strong for the human aircraft to penetrate. It seemed like an impossible task until Lysander stepped forward with a plan that would require the ultimate sacrifice. "The infected can get us there," he said, his young face set with grim determination. "They've been building human catapults all morning. If someone can carry a portable EMP device." "I'll do it," Zephyr said without hesitation. "I'm the lightest person here with the technical knowledge to operate the device." The infected seemed to understand the plan without explanation, quickly modifying one of their catapult systems to launch a human payload toward the mothership's exposed core. As Zephyr strapped the EMP device to her back, she felt the weight of humanity's future pressing down on her shoulders. Evangeline approached and took her hand one final time. "The different people say thank you. They say you helped them remember what it means to protect something precious." The catapult launched Zephyr through the air with bone-jarring force, sending her arcing toward the alien mothership's damaged hull. Around her, the battle raged with desperate intensity as both human and infected forces provided covering fire for her approach. She could see the alien core pulsing with malevolent energy, its organic surfaces writhing with patterns that hurt to look at directly. As she crashed through the opening in the mothership's hull, Zephyr activated the EMP device with her last conscious thought. The electromagnetic pulse tore through the alien vessel's nervous system, causing cascade failures that rippled outward from the core. The mothership convulsed like a dying animal, its bioluminescent patterns flickering and fading as its consciousness was torn apart by the electronic assault. The massive vessel began to fall, its organic hull breaking apart as it crashed into the valley below. The smaller alien craft, suddenly cut off from their command structure, fled toward the upper atmosphere in disorganized retreat. The battle was over, but the cost had been devastating. In the aftermath, as survivors from both species tended to their wounded, a strange peace settled over Rally Point Omega. The infected had lost thousands of their number, but their sacrifice had saved not just the human survivors, but potentially all life on Earth. The alliance forged in desperation had become something more, a new understanding between two branches of humanity. Dr. Cross worked alongside infected medics, sharing medical knowledge that might help both species heal from the trauma of war. General Steele coordinated with infected leaders through Evangeline's translation, planning for a future where both modified and unmodified humans could coexist. As the sun set over the battlefield, Octavia's communication equipment picked up signals from around the world, other survivor groups reporting similar victories, the alien invasion fleet in full retreat, and the first tentative communications between human and infected settlements. The war was over, but the real work was just beginning. Humanity had been forever changed by the infection and the alien invasion, split into two species that would need to learn to live together on a world that had been scarred by conflict. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in months, it was a future worth fighting for. In the growing darkness, the survivors of Rally Point Omega, both human and infected, worked side by side to build something new from the ashes of the old world. They had learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about preserving what made life worth living. And in that lesson, perhaps, lay the seeds of hope for a better tomorrow. The radio crackled one final time with Zephyr's voice, transmitted from the wreckage of the alien mothership in her final moments. "This is Zephyr Blackwood, broadcasting to all survivors. The invasion is over. We won. But remember, we didn't win alone. We won together. Both kinds of human fighting for the same world. Don't forget that when you're building whatever comes next." The transmission faded into static, but her words echoed across the airwaves, carrying a message of unity and hope to every corner of a world learning to heal.